So, Gabriel, clearly you spent a long time making this film. Can you put in perspective for us how many years you spent on it, and what was it that drew you to the story in the first place?
Well, I spent a lot less years working on this film than Mark spent in prison, I'll say that much. But at some point we sort of joined on the same pathway, so it was about a 14-year process. I found Mark's story in 2001 when I was right out of college, and I was looking for a film to do around prison issues, and I got hooked up with Human Rights Watch, and they wanted to do a project on prison rape. And I started researching all over the country, looking at different stories. I was turning over every kind of stone that I could, looking for compelling narratives that could somehow embody this nationwide issue of prison rape. And in so doing, I came across this article which is in the film called Locked Alone on X-Wing, which gets into the worst of the worst prison tier and the worst prison in Florida and maybe the nation, and detailed this one guy who was the nonviolent offender who had never physically harmed another individual in the prison. And he was on this tier, and he was an escape artist. And I thought, well, that's compelling. But I left it. It had nothing to do with the issue that I was doing. And then the very next day, I got in touch with this woman, J.D. Rabbit, who's one of the people who the film is dedicated to. She still lives in this neighborhood, actually. And she had an organization called Stop Prisoner Rape. And I was looking for something on another guy, and she said, I don't have any of that. And I was kind of getting off the phone disappointed, and I guess she felt bad for me. And she said, well, I do have 15 years of letters from a prison punk named Mark Defriest. I said, well, is that the same Mark that Mark Defriest, who's an escape artist? And she said, well, he might have mentioned something about that. And I thought, wow, that's two sides of the same character. That's like a lot of range, you know what I mean? Like this public personality of an escape artist, and she's got 15 years of like the most vulnerable, kind of painful experience somebody can imagine. And when I got the letters, I was just hooked. And after that, I just kept going and going. And all those, the filmmaking was like a catalyst for the story itself. Dr. Berlin comes out of the woodwork because, I call, and like a lot of pieces sort of started to match up, but really it started with those letters.
So to clarify, Dr. Berlin, the psychiatrist who kind of changes his mind, he got drawn back into this because of the film?
I mean, if I hadn't have called him, he wouldn't have had any occasion to know anything about Mark Defriest. He had left that behind. So, it's a kind of an interesting component of like what happens when you turn the camera on. I mean, people dance under the lights. Who knows if the parole commission would have ever done anything kind for him. But, when you kind of give them a platform and enough evidence of an excuse in a sense to change their mind, then it becomes possible.
Can you update us on the case today?
Yeah, so we actually had a really interesting last month. It's really confusing, and I dare any of you to try and understand it back and forth. I mean, I still don't understand it, but March 2015, he paroled to a 1-year parole ineligible sentence, which should have been done in March of this year. And so when we went to Florida last end of February for the next special hearing, it was supposed to be ostensibly to let him out, to set the conditions of parole. When I got there, they were ready to rescind his parole. They had sent the wrong file to Oregon, and he had been held on a life sentence for the last year. He had gone from all that great treatment that he'd had in New Mexico, where he made all that progress and was, had a job in painting the units and, all that kind of stuff. He had the yard. You see how healthy he looks kind of towards the end of the film. Well, anyway, they had sent him to Oregon with the wrong file somehow, and they held him on a life sentence. And then he got a disciplinary report for marijuana in his system. And I was really taken with this. This was about Thanksgiving of last year. I said, well, you kind of let me down, all this kind of stuff, when he got out of solitary confinement. And then it come to find out that he says he hasn't done it. Well, I said, well, okay, well, I'm supposed to believe that they doctored your urine sample or whatever. And he said, I don't know what to say. I didn't do it. I'm not going to stick my finger in an electrical socket. And there's a guy that stuck his finger in a lot of electrical sockets. I trust him. So, I Google false positives on THC screening test, and it comes up as ibuprofen. well, everybody knows that Mark has headaches. And the Oregon nursing protocol in the Department of Corrections, they can hand out as much of the medication like Tylenol, Advil, any of that stuff. And I got all the lab reports, and they did a screening test, which is a $4.95 test that they charged Mark Defriest for. And they didn't do the confirmation test. At the juvenile level in Oregon Department of Corrections, it's an automatic thing. If you test positive on a screening test, they have to do a confirmation test because that's the only sure way. Anyway, they gave him a disciplinary report. They almost cost him his parole. And I went down there on February 23rd, talked to both commissioners and then a state senator, and some things happened. And then they set his parole date for August 23rd, 2016. And between now and then, we have 6 months to convince California to not ask for him to come back. He owes them 2 years for weed and a handcuff key in the 2000s when he was held there after Frank Valdez's murder. And Alabama, he owes them 8 months for a car he stole on an escape. So that's the role of the audience at this point. Is like you can write letters to the state of California and Alabama on his behalf, or tell me anybody you know.
So that's wild. I mean, he's really been moved around in parts of the film that you're talking about undisclosed locations, and so it's not exactly clear what you're describing now, that he's been in multiple different states.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the whole lid's been blown off of everything. You know, like the whole idea that at some point he was on Interstate Compact he's a kind of protected witness in this Frank Valdez murder case. That was a case where they ultimately acquitted all the officers, but Mark was almost killed for his chance to get out of Florida. And that's a whole saga that I don't really get into in the film, but after Frank Valdez's murder, you know, Mark was attacked. They finally let him to the yard. You saw that he didn't get to go to the yard very often, like once every couple of years. And they finally let him go to the yard, but they mixed rival people together and had him almost killed 3 times. But he finally got out to California, and he brought a joint and a handcuff key with him, and they frowned upon that. And he got 2 years for that.
So you first heard about the case 15 years ago, and your film comes out in 2014. In the time between you heard about the case and the time you finished the film, were you constantly thinking about the film? Or were you thinking that, like, I'll get this film done in the next year? Or what was that process like?
Yeah, I watched it tonight, and I was thinking about, like, oh my God, it's so long ago. Like, I was thinking, I went with to shoot a fundraising trailer basically in 2007. I finally got phone recordings with Mark, and that was the big break in the filmmaking aspect of it, because for a long time I was writing it as a screenplay because I had no access to Mark. But I started in 2007 being able to record conversations, and then he started to give me this cast of characters. So I was like, well, let me get down there and interview some of these people. And that's when I went down there with Lee Hirsch, 2 DVX100 cameras that were, shooting DV tapes, and we're like literally making a little mini movie about all the things that happened down there. We went back to the Florida State Hospital. That's where, I like ran around thinking the hospital had been closed down. It was just a Sunday. So we're like, like running around the hospital. And that was where, I just look at it and I go, my God, my daughter was born in 2008, and I was sort of like swore I'd be done with it by, the end of 2009. And then, it was like a sucker punch when they're like 2009, at the end of the 2009 hearing, they're like, it's not going to be 1 year, it's going to be 2 years until you can come back. And I was thinking, my God, I'm just never, ever, ever, ever going to finish this film. The film is not a diagnosis. It actually, I feel like we sort of crowdsource the diagnosis through audience members coming up to me after screenings. The first person who saw a rough cut who said that he seemed like he was on the autism spectrum was a cousin whose son is on the Asperger's, and then a woman who does childhood work with diagnosing Asperger's and working with kids on the spectrum, wrote a letter to the Florida Parole Commission after a screening in Florida we had in 2014, and that's what she thought. And nobody really knows. And I think the headaches do point to the fact that he probably does have brain injury. I mean, the manic, the 2 to 4 hours of sleep a day and all that kind of stuff. There's some broken biological aspects of his brain, and then I think there's some predisposition behavior that I think is probably that he's on the spectrum, that meant that he was an infuriating person to deal with for even his mother. In a sense that there was no frame for, I think, a lot of people to understand how to deal with him from a very early age. He was brilliant, but he was antisocial. But he wasn't psychopathic or sociopath. He just didn't want to really be around people or understand people. And to this day, the guy does not understand how to tell his own story. Like, he literally, like, in a situation where somebody would give, you're seeing a doctor for the first time, or anybody who might potentially be able to help you. I always try and get a little pitch in, like a little story in, like this is where I'm trying to give a little context. He gives nothing. He's very short answers, no framing of anything. And I think as a result, he just never understood the legal process or anybody who was trying to help him in any way. And that, in many ways, is one of the definitions of incompetency. People who do not understand how to participate in their own legal defense, who don't understand the true adversarial nature and how to manage it, they don't belong being held culpable, fully culpable for their crimes, or certainly not to be sentenced at that stage. And that, I think, is sort of the crux of the issue for him. I mean, it's a great question. In a way, the animation was because I thought he had like a comic book style size of life. You know what I mean? In a sense that I wanted audiences to be able to go on that ride with him. And I felt kind of from the beginning like that there was some good openings for, if I could record phone conversations, then I could get. So it wasn't to address what you're talking about. But what you're talking about is why it also took so many years to edit the film. And I think for anybody who's kind of like a filmmaker, you're familiar with long edits, but it was a 3+ year edit that we did at Found Object with the editor Nick Clark and Charlie, who's my producing partner. We basically just had a really hard time getting people to be sympathetic to Mark. Like, it wasn't just sympathetic. It was just I don't want you to think like I'm like trying to like draw out your love for Mark or anything like that. But I want you to be able to sit through the movie. You know what I mean? Like, and that was like the big problem. People were just like pissed off at him. They were like, well, why do you keep escaping? That people had like no sympathy for him. And he doesn't engender sympathy. And he's not asking for your sympathy. He's good at telling these like ribald kind of stories and the repetitive jokes. Oh my God, the repetitive jokes, with the I shot the president or I shot Lincoln. Like that, he thinks that's hilarious, and he says it like, many, many, many times. That's the guy that was hard to make palatable for people. And so I think, there was an aspect of the ordering of the narrative that was just, it bedeviled us for so long. Like, when will you introduce the first crime? I always knew that in a movie about somebody that escapes from prison, you have to put the crime in the first scene, very, very, very far up front, because people want to know, well, how did you end up there? But it took a long time to sort of just figure out. It was a really alchemy. It's just, what you point out is like an essential character facet of him that makes him a fascinating character. And he says it in the scene with Dr. Berlin at the end, when Berlin's like, oh man, you could have been a little bit more clever about this and you would have been out years ago. And he's like, yeah, but I'm still alive. Like, and a lot of people around me, they're dead. Because he was living in like a no holds barred, like zero-sum game world in Florida State Prison in the 80s and 90s. Like, I can't, like, whatever is in the movie, like when the warden's like, it was the hellhole of this earth, he's really not exaggerating. It was a out of control, violent world, but it was also filled with sexual predation. It was filled with deprivation in the sense that, like, he got to California's SHU, they call it the SHU, the super housing unit at Pelican Bay in 2000, and he was so happy. He's like, I got a TV and radio and all this kind of stuff. And in Florida, he had nothing, and he couldn't go to the yard, and he could get beaten, and he got raped, and there was just, it was a maddening world where many people died. many, many people died, and including 43 people executed by the state underneath him. You know, so he was living in a world of where mortality is just right there. And I think that's his pride point. And I think what we dealt with over the last few years was like, how do you tell a guy like that, oh, actually, there is still this other world out there that you should feel somewhat comfortable about trying to adjust your behavior for, even though you're still living in this other world that is, there's a lot of, you know, danger in that world. And that's been the really tough kind of transition right now. It's like Mark is being held tonight at the highest level of custody in Oregon, despite the fact that he is on parole and has had near perfect behavior for the last 5-6 years. And that is because of that BS disciplinary report that I told you about, and the failure of Florida and Oregon to make up for the fact that they sent the wrong file and said that he was on a life sentence. So there was both systemic failure and then a failure to acknowledge truths that we've brought forward with a forensic expert who analyzed the lab test. And that is causing Mark to be in danger now. And at the same time, he's being asked to be perfect in order to not have his parole rescinded in August. So it is a high wire act, you know, to get out of prison. And I was looking at this movie tonight going, my God, he's been hopeful since 2010. And it's 2016. And that's just coming off the mountain, you know.
You know, we see so many documentaries and fiction films about the horrors of prison in America. It's a kind of staple of American entertainment. So it can't be said that anyone in this country doesn't have an idea that our prison system is a really screwed up place. And yet it's nothing that, you know, ever galvanizes any kind of political action. It's, we can sit back and watch it on TV and kind of switch it off as, you know, that's someone else's problem. And I wonder, in all your experience following this case and being in that world, if you see, you know, any hope for you know, a kind of more of a political movement to change that system.
Yeah, I was thinking about this today as well. I mean, you know, even as all this craziness was happening in Florida, there were places you could be imprisoned in America, even the same year, same day, where you would get totally different treatment. And you might get a model program for reentry or for treatment of your whatever mental challenges, disabilities, what have you. It's not that a better way doesn't exist. A better way does exist. And there's plenty of ways to implement it, but it does have to do with there being a political will, both at the federal level, but also at the state level, to borrow from best practices in other places. And what, you know, I've had a chance to hang out with this guy called Judge Leifman, and he's the Miami-Dade County judge who's been reforming the jail system in Miami, and so that it's not the largest mental health facility in Miami-Dade County. And he has created a no wrong door of entry program for the mentally ill on the streets. And that has become a national model. And President Obama had him and saluted him in the White House and gave him an award. And, you know, there is like now finally, after 2 years of trying, or maybe more than that, some progress in the Florida House and Senate to pass these two bills that he basically co-authored that would finally bring what they promised in the 1960s at the deinstitutionalization period, which was community mental health facilities and care, actual funding for people to stay who have mental illness in treatment centers as opposed to being criminalized. We have made a lot of progress at the state level in many places. Texas, that used to throw away people, we're researching an exoneration project right now in my office at Found Object, and basically, like, you know, Texas reformed its eyewitness policies for death row cases and capital cases, so that it's not so easy to have one person just say, oh, you did it, and then you end up on death row. You know, like, change is happening, but it does have to do with I think it really does have to do with all of us being vigilant, you know, and just keeping the pressure on. It's a really interesting and hard question. I mean, I would just say, first of all, we have established a parole plan for him. I mean, I've been active now. I've sort of jumped the tracks. When I was making the film, I was much more comfortable to observe. Not 100% observing, I don't want to lie to you guys, but I wasn't like speaking at his parole hearings. Like I spoke at the last hearing, and I have been very active in finding the resources for him in Oregon, where his wife lives, for him to parole. I mean, I've talked to the Community Outreach Incorporated, where he's going to do his halfway house time, and spoken to that person. And I know the daytime drop-in centers around the county where he's going to go. I know all that, and I think that level of comfort, we can at least all know that this guy isn't just going to drop out the prison door and ride home kind of thing. That happens a lot, of course, but this wouldn't be the case with Mark. And the other thing is, I'm just going to make it up as I go. I really would like now to be in a kind of full-time production, you know, serializing the story and figuring out how between now and August we're really going to figure out how to get him to walk on August 23rd. I'm doing a lot of work on that with California lawyers and looking for resources in Alabama, just trying to figure all this out. But I have a feeling that I'll be there when he's out on whenever it is, whether it's August 23rd or 2017 or whenever. You know, I don't know, but I will be there, and I'll probably keep the cameras rolling for a little while just to make sure he's not completely crazy. I mean, we had projects that interrupted the flow of the edit, so it wasn't a constant edit. And you know, we do a lot of like social impact storytelling and basically short form content in part of campaigns. And that meant that we did an assembly, we did a rough cut, did a fine cut, thought we had locked it, sent it off to a bunch of people, and then finally I got one of my other producers to agree maybe now would be a good time to show it to some people and just feel out the audience. And I wish we would have done that a long time earlier, because when I finally sat down with an audience, this was like in December of 2013, I was like, oh my God, there's things that really don't work in this movie. I could just feel where people got thrown from the narrative, you know, it just didn't work. And we basically went back into the edit for a month and just did a few things that made all the difference. We just stretched out the narrative so that it was just really two different narratives overlapping, so that there's like the Houdini narrative up to Frank Valdez, and then there's just the parole narrative. It used to be Houdini, X-Wing. It was 3 layers, and it was just mind-bending and crazy and annoying. And so that made all the difference. And I don't really remember that last part of your question.
The screenplay.
The screenplay. Now, finally, you know, there's a creative property, and the people that I lived in LA at the time, and I thought, oh, I'm gonna break a story through a screenplay, and I think we all know that never happens. They always take creative material, and that's more where it's heading right now. And so we've got John Baird, who directed Filth, and Taylor Kitsch, both who are attached in a development sort of state, but there's no production company involved yet. So it's sort of like there's a package, and we're sort of trying to figure out how we're going to get the funding to write the first draft of the screenplay and move forward. But so much has happened in the meantime.
Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Gabriel London.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, yeah.